Shane Logie.
Mr. Chair, now, there's a few different points I'd like to make in this contribution. I would like to go back to the Minister's previous contribution when she started her speech by saying, I don't know what the opposition are talking about when they're talking about children and families and cars. This has got nothing to do with sole parents, I think I remember her saying. Well, if you look at the bill on the front page, and you look at the main purpose of it being extending the youth service, this bill would extend the youth service to include all 19-year-old beneficiaries with children. 18 and 19-year-old beneficiaries without children who are considered to be at significant risk of long-term welfare beneficiary.
That's what I said.
No, Minister, that's not what came across in your speech. You were saying it was not about children, and so the concerns of people talking about children and families was irrelevant to this, which actually, when it covers all 19-year-old beneficiaries with children, I think talking about families, it is relevant. And when we talk about cars, that's relevant because this is extending an extended sanction regime, extended obligations and more opportunities for sanctions to a larger group of people. So therefore, when people have the ability for their income to be cut, it makes it harder to pay your rent and it makes it harder to keep a roof over your head. So it's not a long stretch to be talking about families and to be talking about cars. The Minister also talked about how it was more important to focus on the benefit rates rather than needs, because those young people who are not in employment, education or training, well, that's just irrelevant because they might be just happy and not to be in employment, education or training. Well, I still haven't heard the argument about why are the unemployment rates more important than engaged young people who are either setting themselves up to be further their education and to participate in life or through employment. Why is the unemployment receiving a benefit the critical factor? I still have not heard the argument for that. And because, pardon? I just heard some mumbling over there. I couldn't quite work that out. So we also heard that the evidence is clear, that this is the way to go forward, except actually the evidence is deeply contested. It is not clear. What we know is that what the government's conceptualised as an investment approach is actually predictive risk modelling, and that the quality of the information that you put into that model will affect the outcome. Sorry, Mr. Chair, not you, that the government puts in will affect the outcome, as well as the quality of the program, as well as what you're driving all of this towards. And so we know that the data that the government is talking about at the moment, that they're going to put into this, is child, youth and family contact, educational outcomes and gender. We know that that data has 58% of young people who are in contact and care and protection basis with child, youth and family are Māori. We heard from officials very disturbing comments in regarding about whether this may have significant consequences for Māori in terms of their alienation from the system, and whether it may be perceived, you couldn't put in race as one of those factors because that would be perceived as racist, fairly. But whether actually you may have the same result because of that sway through child, youth and family in terms of the data. And the consequence, their response was, don't worry, we'll get them anyway. That is of concern to the Green Party, and I would say that in terms of there are so many stories that have been told in this House and that all of us know of people in their experience in school, their experiences with the police and the experiences with child, youth and family that recognise racism is a problem in our country. And if we are putting data into this model that is reliant on the results of institutionalised racism, then we are at risk of exacerbating the harm of that. And we can't allow that to happen. And this legislation will do that, Mr. Chair.
Chair Nogie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also, we don't have evidence that the program, which is the middle stage of this whole process, is working. As we know that actually the number of young people not in education and training is increasing. With the analysis of the success of this scheme has not comprehensive. We do not have comprehensive data for that yet. And this government that continually tells us it's being data driven and it's all about the data, they are not giving us the data to be able to prove and justify this. You know, that it's been happening and available for this group of people, and they're extending it to adults, and that has been widely criticised by the Salvation Army, by the Family Violence Clearinghouse, by other organisations that are very worried about this, and rightly so. And we do not have the evidence as yet that this approach and the programs being provided work. And then I've given the critique already about where this is driving. It's not driving. There is no explicit target about improving the well-being or opportunities or life outcomes of our young people. It is solely about reducing welfare financial liability. And that drives the work, and that is not for the benefit of us in the society. And I would just want to also pick up on the government's SOPs, and there's a fair stack of them that have been added, I think, in the last couple of days that have actually not been considered by the Select Committee, and significant number of them are technical, but not all of them. Some of them actually have substantive impact. And I'd like to recognise the new clause 27A, which will require young people to provide details of accommodation costs, service costs, lawful debt and liabilities, recognising that they're already required to provide that information, but by moving that clause into section 171E, it clarifies that a failure to provide that information within 20 working days is an obligation failure and may attract sanctions. So there's 2 points I want to make about this, which has not been considered by the public and has not been considered by the Select Committee, is that I would suggest that the fact that they're moving this into the place that enables them to apply sanctions, and that time frame of 20 days, is that some young people, it seems to suggest, are resisting providing that information. So that these young people are not necessarily, despite what the government would seem to have us to suggest to us, loving the service and finding it fabulous and supportive and strength-based, that actually some of these young people who have been put into the service are resisting it, as I could understand why they might, and that further sanctions are being put in place to force them to provide very personal details to these people who are supposed to be changing their lives. I suggest that this is actually an indication of the failure of the system. And another aspect that's been brought in terms of the amendments that have been brought to this House very late in the day, is a new provision effectively extending the youth sections regime to all young people on money management. Also provides that if a young spouse or partner of a specified beneficiary who's not subject to money management fails to comply with an obligation placed on the young person under that same section, that failure is again treated as failure to comply with the work test or with work preparation obligations and attracts relevant sanctions. Mr. Chair, I think it's dodgy to bring amendments to the House that further extend the ability to apply sanctions without public scrutiny, without proper process, without the consideration of the Select Committee. And I really am quite concerned at what the Minister has brought to this House. And I think people should be questioning the government on that. I would also like to bring up another point which isn't central. Oh no, actually I would like to go back to another point where the Minister's talking about how great this is. And there was mentions made around youth development. And one of the things that in our society we have an issue with violence, and many of these young people will have experienced violence in their childhood. And what that does, Mr. Chair...
Brett Hudson.
I move that the question be now put.
No. Any other calls?
Mr. Chair.